Hello, so welcome to this geography sunset session with me, Mr. Pato. Today we're going to be looking at paper one, so we're going to be looking at some physical geography, and the particular nugget of knowledge that we are focusing on is how to answer an exam question on protecting cold environments. So in terms of the learning outcomes for this sunset session, at the very least, we'll be able to describe and explain the methods that get used to sustainably manage cold environments in an exam context, so in an exam question. The next step, still in an exam context, but we'll be able to explain 4 different strategies: the use of technology, the role of governments, international agreements, and conservation groups. And then finally, the sort of gold standard by the end of this sunset session is, are we able to analyse how the use of technology, the role of governments, international agreements, and conservation groups can be used to balance the needs of the economy and conservation of the environment in cold environments. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of where we are going today. So instructions for success. So this masterclass will have both teaching slides and working slides, and also assessment slides. So the teaching slides will have an explanation from a teacher. If it's in red font, it's a teaching slide. So you need to listen and take notes if there is a red font. I've also kind of included that make notes logo to give you an idea of when you should be making notes. I'll try and point it out verbally as well. The working slides, these will have timed exam questions or activities taken from past papers. So you need to use your knowledge from the teaching slides and your notes to help you answer these questions. These will be in the assignment section of Teams for you to use. Wearing hats during a sunset session or a masterclass is optional, but working slides and teaching slides are not. So make sure you get those 2 bits done. The last part, and another bit that is not optional, are the assessment slides. These will have a mark scheme or some kind of green pen activity for you to do so that you can self-assess your answers and see how you've done. So we're starting with a picture of the 46th President of the United States of America. And you might be wondering why. Well, when we think about cold environments, we might think that they're an old case study that perhaps doesn't have any relevance anymore. But one of the Trump administration's last actions was to open up an area of wilderness right next to where we are going to be focusing on today, called the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. However, President Biden's administration, one of the first things they have done is sign an executive order to stop people drilling for oil in the National Wildlife Refuge. So this is a topic that is very current. It's happening right now. And the idea of protecting cold environments, it might be an exam question, but it's something that we as geographers need to think about in general. So this is the first of your teaching slides. You can see the make note symbol. So when we think about cold environments, we're generally talking about the Arctic, so the Arctic Circle. Think about the North Pole and the ice cap or the sea ice that surrounds it. But we're also thinking about Antarctica, so that solid land mass of ice on the southern pole of Earth. So this is a teaching slide. You're going to see an OMG revision video. All you need to do is make notes on what a cold environment actually is and what they are like. Characteristics of cold environments. Cold environments is just a place where the temperature is at or below 0 degrees for a long period of time. There are 2 types: polar environments, which are a bit more extreme, and tundra environments, less extreme. A polar environment, temperature can get as low as minus 50 degrees Celsius. As a result, the ground is permanently frozen. You don't get much vegetation as a result. You only really get mosses and lichens and very little precipitation. An animal that's really well adapted is a polar bear. It has white fur to camouflage from its prey. Seals, black eyes and a black nose to absorb heat, and also wide footpads so it can walk on really dense snow. A tundra environment won't be as cold, so it's less extreme. We'll get down to minus 20 degrees Celsius in the winter and just above 0 in the summer. As a result, we get more vegetation than the polar environment. So we've got some mosses, some lichens. We might also get some shrubs or ferns. The soil is not permanent. Some of the soil is not permanently frozen, but most of it is what we call permafrost. And
Plant that's really well adapted to the tundra environment is a bearberry. It's got hairy stems which trap and insulate heat. It's got bright red berries which get eaten by birds and help to distribute the seeds when they poop them out. And also, they're very low lying to keep them safe in the strong tundra winds.
That bloke definitely knew his geography. Didn't have a hat though, so pretty disappointing. Okay, another teaching slide. So the reason why cold environments need protecting, they're extremely fragile and they can be easily damaged by human activities. So damage to an undeveloped, undisturbed sort of wilderness environment can take years or even decades to recover. So even building a small road in a tundra or polar environment can take decades to repair itself. Cold environments have rich reserves of oil and gas and gold, though, and people want to extract those resources so they can make money and boost their economic development. So there's this kind of seesaw between, do we exploit the economic opportunities, do we look after the environment, and we are trying to kind of seesaw and look after and balance both. So cold environments need protecting because they protect biodiversity by providing habitat. So a lot of animals that live in cold environments are highly specialized. They don't live anywhere else on the planet. They also provide an arena for scientists to study wild animals in their natural habitat, and they are home to some indigenous people. So, in terms of the working slide you are going to be working on, until we get to the exam question, this is the only working slide you are going to be using. It's a mind map. So in the middle, we've got how can cold environments be sustainably managed. And around the outside, all I want you to do is make some really concise notes. So try and simplify them and summarize them as much as you can about the different strategies that can be used to sustainably manage cold environments. So the first method is the use of technology. So one thing you absolutely have to add to your mind map is that the first strategy, number one, is the use of technology. And when we think about the use of technology, our case study is the Trans-Alaskan pipeline. The trans just means across, so it's a pipeline that goes across Alaska. You can see that in the map on the left. So in 1969, they discovered oil at a place called Prudhoe Bay in the north of Alaska. Winter sea ice in the Arctic prevented oil being transported by tanker, so they had to find an alternate way. So they built the Trans-Alaskan pipeline in 1974, and that transported the oil 1,700 kilometers from Prudhoe Bay in the north all the way down to the south of Alaska to a port called Valdez. So thinking about how the use of technology can be sustainable, here we've got what the problem was, how we made a sustainable solution through the use of technology. So all from the ground is very hot, and that can melt the permafrost, the permanently frozen soil. So the Trans-Alaskan pipeline is raised and insulated to retain heat and stop it from melting that permafrost. Also, large herds of animals such as caribou migrate across the route of the pipeline, so they raise the pipeline to allow caribou to migrate underneath. As you can see in the photo, the caribou has lots of clearance and is going to have no problem walking under the pipeline. Also, the pipeline crosses rivers and mountain ranges such as the Brooks Ranges, so pumping station keeps the oil moving, so it can sort of travel up mountains or through mountains, and the pipeline passes beneath rivers to minimize effects on the landscape. So you can see them digging an underground sort of cavity for the pipeline to go underneath the river. They call it a culvert. Okay, so possible cracks caused by earthquakes can cause oil leaks. So what have they done about it? The pipeline is supported and can slide. So you can see some slider beams either side of the pipeline there. The pipeline is bendy first. It's not a straight line, which is more resistant to earthquakes, but it can also slide. The flow of oil also stops if there is a leak automatically. So as soon as there is a leak, the oil stops flowing. The second thing that I want you to add to your working slide is the action by governments. These are actions that governments can take to sustainably manage cold environments. The first one, or the first thing to say, is the United States government has been involved in the protection of Alaska ever since oil was discovered there in the 1960s. So when we're thinking about action by governments, we're in Alaska, and with the Trans-Alaskan pipeline, we are thinking by actions by US government. Now, different administrations, different presidents have been had different focuses. Some are focused on economic development, some are focused on conservation. One policy that came about in 1970 was the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA for short. That ensures that companies involved in the extraction of fossil fuels and transportation of them look after the environment, but also the rights of indigenous people. And as you can see, those Algonquian people, indigenous people of Alaska, they're not necessarily what we might think of when we think of indigenous people. They look very much like westernized people. So these are people with livelihoods, people with homes, and people with rights that need to be protected. Also, the introduction of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in the north of Alaska. So that was created, and it's a 19 million acre in size, so about 19 million football pitches, and is home to thousands of caribou and millions of birds. So we need to think about how we can conserve that biodiversity. And then finally, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They oversee sustainable fisheries and the oceans around the Arctic Circle in North America. Easy way to remember it, or an easy way to remember one of those actions by governments. Noah, just like the character in the Bible, save the animals. Another way that we can look at sustainably managing cold environments or protecting them is the work of conservation groups. So an example is the WWF, or the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So the conservation groups such as WWF work to protect cold environments. They work with local communities to manage critical ecosystems, and they support scientific research. And that research aims to protect animals such as the polar bear. Another part of that research, so they also work with oil companies, local indigenous organizations, and government regulators to plan for a sustainable future in the Arctic. So to think, how can we sustain that economic growth, those economic opportunities, whilst also ensuring we protect and conserve the environment and the biodiversity that exists in these cold environments. So the exam question that we are going to be tackling this sunset session, that's what they're called, is as follows. So it's a 9-marker. So it's a big one, and it says, evaluate the strategies used to balance the needs of economic development and conservation in cold environments. So there are lots of sirens going off in my geography exam question brain, but the first one is that I need to do some dual coding here. So the first one, I can see that it's talking about economic development, so I'm going to draw my pound sign, but also it's talking about conservation. Now, conservation is about protection of the environment, so I'm just going to draw a little T to remind myself. The next thing we need to do is KFC the question. Think about, what knowledge do I need to answer this question? What's the focus and what's the command word? So the knowledge, it's talking about strategy. So what is our case study? It's the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline in Alaska. What are the strategies involved? Well, we know there's the use of technology, but alternatives include action by governments and work by conservation groups as well. Okay, what about the focus of this question? Well, the focus of this question is asking me, are the strategies balancing the needs of economic development and conservation? Or in more simple terms, are these strategies very good at balancing money and nature? Are there some strategies that put more emphasis on money, economic development, or are there some more strategies that put more emphasis on looking after the environment? That's the discussion I'm going to need to have in my answer. And then finally, the command word, the C, evaluate. If the question says evaluate, we know this. If it says evaluate, to what extent, or assess, we need to make a decision. Are the strategies effective in our case study? Is the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline effective? Which is the most effective strategy? Is it action by governments, or is it the use of technology? And which is the least effective? And we'll talk about how we can do some of that comparison, or how we can kind of shrink that down and using appeal structure, cover all those bases. So I've kind of shifted all that up to the top left because I'm now going to take us through the exam question. So I'm going to do it in black just because it's the easiest to see. So first of all, I need to make a decision. The command word says evaluate, so I need to make a decision. And I'm going to say that I agree to some extent that the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline, or I think to some extent the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline is effective. So I'm going to start my answer with my introduction, answering the question. So I believe to some extent that the Trans-Alaskan pipeline. And then I'm going to use the wording from the question. So I agree, or I believe to some extent, that the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline balances the needs of economic development and conservation. So what I've done there is not only have I made a decision, so I've said I believe to some extent that the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline balances the needs of economic development and conservation, but I've also very slyly introduced my case study to whoever's marking this question as well. So I've said I've got an opinion on this topic, but I've also got a case study that I'm going to use to back it up. So if I'm an examiner reading this, which me and Mr. Thicket are when it comes to the summer, then generally if we see this start to an answer, we'd be pretty happy, we'd be in a pretty good mood. So now we need to think about how we can develop that into a Peel paragraph. So don't forget we have our point, then we have some evidence to back up our point, then we explain our point, and then finally we link it back to our original point or to the question. So in terms of our point, I'm going to focus on the use of technology because that's what the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline is. So one way that has successfully balanced the needs of economic development in Alaska is the use of technology. Now I need to provide some evidence. So I've done my point. Now I need to do my evidence. The evidence for this is that the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline keep clicking the button. Is raised so that the oil can flow through it, but also local wildlife such as caribou, so being nice and specific, in the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve can pass under it. And what you may not have noticed, what I've kind of again slyly done, is that I've talked about how the pipeline is raised. So I've talked about the use of technology. I've mentioned that oil can flow through it, but I've also talked about local wildlife. So I've mentioned the oil, which is the economic development, but I've also talked about the wildlife, which is the conservation. And I'll link that back to the question in a second. So finally, an explanation. And with evaluate questions, with assess questions, there is no better evaluation than a comparison. So I can make my point look really good by comparing it to a different method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain why that is a good thing using a different method by comparing it to a different method. So this is more effective than action by governments. So introducing my second strategy. As the National Environmental Policy Act, I'm just going to do it in shorthand because I'm running out of space, such as the NEPA, as NEPA only conserves the environment, whereas the flow of oil in the raised pipeline also allows economic development. And then the last bit I need to do is link all this back to the question. So I've given my evidence, the transatlantic, trans-Alaskan pipeline and the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve. I've explained it by comparing it to another strategy, also evaluating at the same time. So this method is better, this method is not as good. And I've also used the wording from the question. So the last thing I need to do is link it back to the question. This shows that the use of technology, the pipeline, is more effective than action by governments as it balances both economic development and conservation, whereas government action can hinder or slow down economic development. So that is how you would write a perfect Peel paragraph, or near perfect Peel paragraph, that includes all the various parts of Peel, addresses the knowledge, the command, and the focus of the question, but most importantly, makes a decision on the statement that we've been asked to. So what I'm going to do is clear that. So if you want to write it down, then pause the video and write it down, but I'm going to clear it now just because otherwise it will be on the next screen. So now is your opportunity to have a go at this question. So pause the video and spend 9 minutes answering the question now. Okay, then once you've answered that question in the assignment section of Teams, you're then going to come back and you're going to get a green pen if you've got one, or a different color pen, and you're going to decide, have a look at the level descriptors and decide what level you think your answer would go into. So does it make simple statements? Does it make developed points? Or does it make detailed points? So then you can decide what level your answer falls into. I then want you to decide how many marks you picked up. So if there was no attempt to evaluate, then you're going to probably be around 1 or 2 marks. If there was an attempt to evaluate the balance between economic development and conservation, probably be about 4 or 6 marks. But if there's clear evaluation and you compared one strategy to another, you're probably going to be pushing those 7 to 9 marks. And the most important, and probably the last thing I'm going to ask you to do, is I want you to just go through and highlight or label the best parts of your answer, the parts of your answer that maybe can get rid of or go in the bin, and then finally the parts of your answer that you should build. So if you've answered the question in the first sentence, or introduced a case study strategy, or compared the effectiveness of two strategies, or linked your point to economic development and conservation, like the question asks, then you can label those the best part of your answer. Whereas if you described a strategy, for example, the use of technology, but not linked it to our case study of the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline, you could build on that, so label that build. If you've introduced a case study strategy, so the use of technology in the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline, and commented on its effectiveness, but you've not linked it to economic development or conservation, you've not used those words from the question, label that as a build. Likewise, if you've only spoken about one strategy, or you've spoken about a strategy but not used the keywords technology, international agreements, role of governments, you can label those as the parts of your answer to build. Don't forget the bin. That's just going to be if you give it a very general description of the problems faced in cold environments, such as they're very fragile, but not evaluated the strategies for economic development and conservation. That's absolutely everything from our sundown session. So I hope that you found it useful, and I hope that you feel more confident answering questions or exam questions on protecting cold environments.